Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. I hope you had some...
I'm at your disposal, man.
I'm also a teacher in high school, so I know how to wait and make sure that everyone closes their phone and all of that. So I'm Adi Sharabani, I'll be your host today, but we will first start with the fireside chat. So originally we planned on bringing Jen Easterly from CISA, and she wasn't able to get to Israel because of some storms and flight changes in the US. So instead of that, we have a very exciting guest today with us. So Nate Fick, US Ambassador at Large for Cyber Defense, and he will be interviewed by Elad, that is a well-known entrepreneur, 25 years, I think, if not more. Board member, advisor, but mostly a great person. So I think that's the most important characteristic of a moderator. So with that said, Nate, I think you still have a hard stop at, in 30 minutes or not? Because you were late a few minutes. I think we can steal some, you know.
Let's see who we're stealing from. I defer to my team on what time we need to leave.
Okay, so the answer is yes, perfect.
Perfect.
Thank you. And with that said, we'll let the fireside chat, and then later on we'll go and interview Mr. Yu, that is the former deputy of 8200 unit, that today is the first time we can publicly talk about him with his name. Spencer Mott is the CISO of Bookings, and Brett, who is the CISO of Microsoft. So we'll get there later.
Adi, thank you very much. And thank you all of you for coming. It's my sincere pleasure to spend the next half hour with a good friend, Nate Fick, and talk about the special role that he's in. But this is not the first time that he's been called Batman. You know, when you have a problem and you need somebody to come fix a situation, and you know, Jen Easterly owes you a beer, I would say. But you know, this is Batman, Cyber Batman. There's a story behind that. Your buddies in the Marine Corps may have something to say about that nickname, and the Albania story is fascinating. We're going to talk about that. But Nate Fick is in a very special role, the U.S. Ambassador at Large for Cyberspace and Digital Policy, the first ever. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time today. We're going to talk about the nature of security, cybersecurity and diplomacy, standards, norms, things like balancing privacy, security, as well as public safety and national security, how those things interact with one another. The balance between, say, pursuing the international common good and dealing perhaps with some good old-fashioned protectionism of local companies that may come up. And then even internally in the State Department, I was going to say how much knowledge, but I'll settle for awareness of cybersecurity issues within the State Department and within the diplomatic community, because there's an educational component to the role, I believe. But before we delve into any of those things, we got to get to know the man. And so spend a little bit of time talking about you on a personal level, how you got into cybersecurity. You know, this is not your first time in Israel, your military service, and so forth. So maybe just start with a personal question. I mean, Nate, as many of you may not know, is a former Marine Corps officer. And here in Israel, military service is compulsory, but it's not in the United States. So I'd love to learn a little bit more about you. So like, what led you to volunteer? And tell us about your time in uniform, and let's just go from there.
Sure. Thanks, Elad. Thanks for having me. I'm pleased to be here with all of you. I'm really sorry that I'm not Jen Easterly. I would be better, smarter, more fun. But yeah, unfortunately, Jen, her flight got canceled. All of her flights got canceled. So she probably would have brought Rubik's Cubes for everyone, her trademark, and I have no such gift. But I'm pleased to be here. So I was in college in the 1990s. It was the sort of generally peacetime after the end of the Cold War. And I didn't want to go be a consultant or an investment banker or go to law school or go to med school or any of the things my college friends were doing. And so I liked the outdoors. I liked leading teams. I was an athlete. And I thought I thought it would be interesting to be an infantry officer. It was 2 years before 9/11.
It's great. I was.
I know you know what I'm talking
I
about.
know exactly what you're talking about. I was an Army officer myself, but during my deployments, had the privilege of leading a squad of Marines that were attached to my unit, and they were some of the best folks I ever got to know. But from the Marines into cyber, or tell us a little bit about sort of your transition
look,
and how you wound up in this chair today, other than Jen Easterly's flights being canceled.
I think this is probably true for all of us, right? The arc of our lives or the path of our careers only makes sense in hindsight. You know, if you look backwards, you can sort of string a coherent narrative together, but looking forward, it was all unknowable. You know, I joined a peacetime military. September 11th happened. I ended up spending, time in a combat military. I got out of the Marines. If I had 20 lives to live, I would have loved for one of them to have been a career doing that. But given one life to live, it's not what I wanted to spend 25 or 30 years of my life doing. I went to business school because I wanted to pick up the skill set to translate kind of building and leading military teams to building and leading civilian teams. I was looking to keep scratching that mission itch. Cybersecurity does that. And I went to Bessemer Venture Partners in order to kind of get a look at small companies, and ended up jumping in and running a company in our portfolio. And it was a restart. I had to take it down to nothing. My first desk was literally an old door on 2 sawhorses. And then 10 years later, it was a big business.
An overnight success 10 years later, as they say. And so, in addition, sort of the military service, another common set of experiences that many at this conference certainly seem to have is sort of the entrepreneurial experience, and certainly that's a big thing here in Israel. So, would love to learn a little bit more about that. But maybe given, actually that's when Nate and I first met, when he was CEO at Endgame, so well over a decade ago. About a decade ago.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I have a lot of admiration for the Israeli technology ecosystem. I think that Israel's probably the example to the world in this area of attracting a lot of really capable young people to public service, screening them in effective ways, getting really good ones into units like 8200, giving them incredible operational experience inside a very positive ethos, and then cheering them on when they leave and recognizing that there are other ways to give back and other ways to serve. And so putting together the kind of the magic of that ecosystem with some government support, R&D and universities, large companies, small companies, venture capital, and you get that all under the kind of overarching protection of things like IP protection and the rule of law, and some magic happens. And the way it seems to start is you get one or two companies do well, and then you end up with a generation of product managers who are your next generation of founders, and kind of the wheel starts turning. And it's been incredible to see it here and participate a little bit in it here. And actually, in my current role, one of the things that I talk about all over the world is looking at this example here, looking at Estonia and in the wake of the Russian attack there, and how over about a 10-year period, the Estonians went from being net importers of security to being net exporters of security. You can sort of point to a small number of examples around the world that could be a model to others.
So, but now you've been to Israel before. You've been to Israel before in the role of an investor, a venture capitalist. But now you're here in this new role, and it's actually a brand new role. So maybe I would love to learn a little bit more about sort of what it's like to be the first ever U.S. ambassador at large for cybersecurity.
Well, having no shoes to fill is better than having large shoes to fill. Like I have Jen's shoes to fill, for instance, sitting here. So this role it goes back to the Cyberspace Solarium Commission in the U.S., which was a bipartisan initiative to kind of tackle holistically how our government was dealing with the transition to this digital age where everything's connected and everything is just as tech is changing every aspect of our lives, it's changing every aspect of our national security, every aspect of our foreign policy. And one of the recommendations of the commission was kind of this realization that our security apparatus, DoD, the intelligence community, is pretty well oriented on these problems. Our Homeland Security apparatus, pretty well oriented on these problems. But we had a bit of a vacuum in our diplomacy. We had a lot of good diplomats doing work in this area, but it wasn't pulled together in an integrated fashion. It wasn't elevated in its sort of representation and reporting structure. And so when I was in my confirmation hearing in the Senate, one of the questions I got was, hey, aren't there too many cooks in the kitchen here? But actually, I think we were filling a gap that needed to be filled. And I believe, maybe I'm a prisoner, we're all prisoners of our own experience to some extent. My formative experiences were in combat in the Marines. I was living failures of diplomacy. And so really have an interest in a strong and effective diplomatic arm of everything we do, so that we can avert, the bad outcomes. And so that was sort of the founding story of the role. And I'll tell you, just at a personal level, I feel like it pulls together every strand of my background. It draws on the military experience. It draws on the private sector experience. I think many of you, or maybe all of you, are CISOs at public companies or big companies. I chaired 2 public company audit committees, where, whether it should report to audit is a separate and worthwhile conversation, but in my case it did. So saw these issues from that perspective. And I feel like I pull on all of it now.
That's great. You talked about sort of like the dearth, or alluded to this, sort of the dearth of people with kind of experience in the private sector, in the financial community, in industry and in government. And kind of, you really bring a blend of multiple perspectives and experiences into this role, which I think is critical.
I naively thought that there wouldn't be a ton of technical talent in government. I will tell you, in the U.S. government, there's an enormous amount of incredible technical talent. I think that's also true in the Israeli government. What is lacking in our government, at least, is commercial sensibility, which is a different thing. Having a little bit of a nuanced appreciation of like how to structure a public-private partnership so it actually makes sense. 5 or 7 years ago, when I was in front of government counterparts being lectured about public-private partnership, it usually meant I give you my data, you classify it, I get nothing back. That didn't feel like much of a partnership.
It's a one-way street.
Right. I think that's changed, actually, in some fundamental ways. I think the war in Ukraine has changed it. The exigency of the moment in Ukraine in the last 15 or 17 months, the migration of the Ukrainian government enterprise to the cloud, the provision of distributed resilient satellite communications, the closing of a very quick threat intel feedback loop among the Ukrainian government, other governments, and companies to blunt Russian cyber attacks inside Ukraine. Yeah, it kills me when I'm out in the world and people say, well, why weren't there any Russian cyber attacks in Ukraine? Like, there have been an enormous number of pretty sophisticated Russian cyber attacks in Ukraine. They didn't work.
So I'm going to spend just a minute or two longer kind of on this role in government, where it fits in government, really trying to understand a little bit more about that. Your story reminded me of an experience I had, many years ago, about 15 or so years ago. I was working on a project at DoD, in this case specifically Department of the Air Force, and they were trying to map out sort of where the Department of the Air Force's role was in cybersecurity. And at the time, they were, in the early days, they were way ahead of certainly the other branches. I can speak for the Army. If you want to do anything cyber-wise, before there was a word cyber and computer and network security, it was always Air Force. But the other branches busted their butts and did a lot of catching up, and then the Air Force was trying to figure out where. Anyhow, so we were sitting in a big conference room at the Pentagon, and there was a bunch of 1-stars and 06s, and they were mapping it out. And if you've never seen a Department of Defense PowerPoint slide, they're really busy. I mean, and so the entire, all the white space on the slide was packed with all the government stakeholders, and this kind of course, the Air Force was in the middle, and then the other branches, and and you had Department of Justice and the FBI, and you had Homeland Security and the various, CISA didn't exist at the time, and of course Cyber Command and NSA and the White House, and it was a beautiful map, and there was a little box in the lower sort of middle part of the screen of the slide, and it said private sector. And there was a line from the Air Force to the private sector, and they were going to appoint like an 06 to be in charge of that line. And then there was another box, kind of a little bit of more white space on the side, that said academia, and there was another, and another colonel to manage that. But it's kind of interesting. It just, when you talked about the dearth of folks in government who kind of have that commercial experience, and that it reminded me of that story. And I agree with you. But given all the stakeholders, how does this, and they've evolved since that experience I had, but how does this role and state sort of work with the others in an integrated, or what's the communication strategy like?
I mean, I use an orchestra analogy, like going to the, going out at night and just listening to a trombone is not that interesting. But going out and listening to a symphony can be very interesting. So the way I think about it is in our system, the National Cyber Director is the conductor of the orchestra, Kemba Walden. It is her job to make sure that all the instruments add up to music, not noise. And then you've got everybody sort of playing their respective instrument in coordination with each other. So Jen, who should be here, has leadership of Homeland Defense in this domain, right, at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. So Jen's remit is primarily domestic, except when she's doing things that are really noteworthy, and international partners are clamoring to do them too, in which case we work together. There's no need to reinvent the wheel in this space. We can copy and paste things that she and her team are doing well and apply them in other parts of the world, and they get customized for unique environments, of course, but there's a lot of demand to internationalize work that she's doing. If DoD, of course, NSA and Cyber Command reaching out and touching people in this domain. We don't have the capability or the authority to do that legally, but those tools are in service of broader foreign policy objectives. So I and we are the diplomats who are not necessarily making policy. It tends to get made at the NSC or the White House. There's the domestic piece that's happening. There's the orchestration. But we're the ones who are multilateralizing it or internationalizing it or negotiating regulations internationally or leading our bilateral engagements with partners, leading cybersecurity assistance to Ukraine, leading cybersecurity assistance to Albania after the Iranian attack there, or to Costa Rica after the Conti ransomware attack. I and we are often the ones in the room across the table from Russians in Vienna or at a dinner with the Chinese in the Philippines. So we have the opportunity to have the dialogues face to face, which is invaluable.
My heart goes out to any parents who had a kid learn trombone or just on their own until they kind of get into the orchestra, and then they just to pick on that metaphor, like if the band or the orchestra is being assembled kind of in the government space, it's like, how far along, how many practices have you had? Like, are you ready for a performance, or are you still kind of, is the band still learning how to, or the orchestra learning how to play together and pick up on each other's cues? Where an honest assessment of sort of where you guys are or where we are in that. So what do you think? I
think it's actually pretty good because it's not being cut from whole cloth, right? It has accreted over time. A lot of these elements have been there for a while. And ours is the newest element. A complicating factor in government, of course, is you have relatively constant personnel turnover. So even if the institutional structures are there, you're always sort of tailoring to new personalities. And of course, it's complicated too by the fact that people are turning over with our counterparts, asynchronously with us. So there's always an element of like learning and adjusting on the fly. But broadly speaking, I think the system's working reasonably well. I mean, the challenge, it's like all of your security enterprises. They're working brilliantly until the Friday night when all of a sudden they're not.
Was Albania your first overseas trip?
My first overseas trip was Romania. Bucharest for it's actually a funny story. So I got confirmed more quickly than I expected in the Senate, and told my wife and my daughters, I said, hey, we don't live in Washington. I said, guys, we're going to go to Washington, and I'll get sworn in, do this job. It'll be great. And instead, I got sworn in by a notary public at a UPS store in Portland, Maine, because I had to, with a line of people behind me waiting to mail their packages who were totally unimpressed by what was happening at the front of the line. And I had to get a diplomatic passport quickly in order to get to Bucharest to whip votes, actually, in the election of the new Secretary General of the International Telecommunication Union, the ITU, one of these multilateral bodies under the UN that since 1865 has been responsible for connectivity standards, basically. So initially making sure that American telegraphs could talk to European telegraphs, could talk to Asian telegraphs, and that connectivity mission has continued straight down to the digital era. And when I was in the private sector, the ITU was sort of like, there be dragons, stay away from that. It was effectively a Russian and Chinese controlled enterprise. But with this election, we had the opportunity to get an American elected. She was running against a former Russian deputy minister of telecommunications, who before that had been a Huawei executive. And so we had sort of a last-ditch vote gathering exercise, and she, Doreen Bogdan-Martin, won in a landslide. So that was my first trip. And it's nice to parachute in on the 1 yard line of someone else's, 2 years of hard work and then claim the victory.
And then but the one thing that I was referring to, and your trip to Albania gained a tremendous amount of notoriety, right? Standing shoulder to shoulder while they were in the midst of an attack. And just love to
So that was,
hear
I
a
think,
little bit
maybe
more
the
about that.
next couple trips later was, after the Iraq War ended in 2016, there was an Iranian dissident group, the MEK, the Mujahideen Khalq, that was had been given sanctuary in Iraq, and they needed a place to go. And Albania is like more patriotic than Alabama in sort of their ethos. And so Albania put their hand in the air and said, "We'll take them." And so there's this large camp of MEK outside Tirana, and they were allegedly launching some cyber attacks into Iran, and the Iranians replied by taking down the Albanian government enterprise. And that was a problem for us because Albania is in NATO, and so we wanted to send a very clear message to Iran not to inadvertently start something that was more significant than they had intended. And so I went to Tirana with our ambassador to the United Nations and our ambassador to Albania, who's obviously in Albania, in order to begin to send that message and then coordinate the incident response in Albania, which has proven to be, I think, a pretty good example of public-private partnership with a lot of good work on the ground by Microsoft and others.
Well, and you're now here in Israel, which many of us think is the, if not the, certainly one of the global hubs of cybersecurity, and your agenda, at least planning-wise, certainly didn't include this event, and we're grateful here. But tell us a little bit more. It's like, why fly sort of the 7,000 to 10,000 miles to come to Israel and spend time?
Yeah, thanks for pointing that. That's why I was late and why I leave early. I'm sorry. Look, I think Israel, by any standard, any measure, is a tech superpower, right? Fights, punches well above its weight in every area of technology, certainly including cybersecurity, both on the public sector side and on the private sector side. And so I, in this role, have a great interest in deepening our relationships with our partners who are both like-minded from a sort of the fundamentals, right? Rule of law, free markets, equal representation for all people, democratic systems, who are also technically adept and technically capable. And so, in the time that we've been here, we've had a bunch of both military, civilian, intel meetings with Israeli counterparts, a bunch of meetings with companies and groups of companies, and then because it's Cyber Week, there have been delegations from other countries in town, and it saves me some air miles if we can meet here.
Right, but being the good executive, a former CEO, you don't go to a meeting without sort of knowing ahead of time what your agenda is, your hopeful outcome. That's right. So could you share with us a little bit about sort of what you'd love to bring back with you from your experience in sort of all these diverse set of meetings you
I
have?
mean, look, there obviously a lot of that is, sort of necessity between us and the counterpart government until it's not. I'll give you an example. We're thrilled that Israel was an early signatory to the counter ransomware initiative. I think a really robust, multilateral, multi-stakeholder, kind of well-organized, well-executed attempt to address this kind of global scourge of ransomware. We want to broaden the coalition of countries that are active parts of CRI, and Israel has partnerships and relationships that are in some places that are closer and more operational than ours. And we want to work with our Israeli counterparts to try to bring a few more of those countries into the CRI.
And is there a message sort of for the sort of the broader Israeli cyber community that given the opportunity to sort of depart or a message to them? I'm saying
Sure.
I'm saying what can we do better? Maybe that's not the right way to frame it, but
No,
from
it's
your
fine.
perspective, what would your guidance and sort of advice be?
It's great. As a diplomat, I often don't lead with what could we do better. It's sort of the sandwich of things that are going great. What could we do better? Things that are going great.
We're very blunt in this
Yeah,
country,
exactly. But let me I'll tell you point blank. So I think the fundamentals are really good. Like obviously the collaboration in particular between NSA and Cyber Command and 8200 and the Israeli intelligence apparatus is tight and important and effective. I think we can deepen our collaboration as between the State Department and the MFA. I think there's more we can do diplomatically together, and so we started talking about that. In terms of things we can do better, I'll give you two. We, in the United States, signed an executive order several months ago prohibiting U.S. government use of commercial spyware. That's a sensitive topic in innovation economies where great companies, interesting companies are being built, and maybe one of their products are these things. And I think we're very sensitive to ensuring that they are not misused. That we don't have companies that are selling commercial spyware to governments that are less inclined to use the capability in accordance with our understanding of privacy and human rights. And we're interested in building a broader coalition around the tenets of that EO. That's one thing we can do better together. I think another thing we can do better together, it meant a lot to us to have Israel join us in publicly attributing the Albanian cyber attack, the Iranian cyber attack on Albania. It increased the legitimacy and the moral authority of that attribution in a way that was very helpful. And I think there's more we can do as like-minded, technically adept countries to multilateralize our attributions in order to reinforce the rules-based order.
That's great. And before I keep going, Adi, I just want to know how much time we have, because I'd love to open it up.
Nate is happy to stay as long as we want. So.
Do we have time?
I'm looking at Rory, who's on the hook back here. Do we have 2 minutes? Okay, we have
All
2
right.
minutes.
So
Any question from the audience?
let's pause here, because I'll anyone in the audience. So Neil, did you have a question?
Maybe let's get a couple, and I'll try to try to
Neil,
weave
go
them
ahead.
together.
So, this is part of your joke, but where would the ambassador for cyberspace live? More importantly, I think it's the question of the expectations of the Solari Commission and the role itself. Where might we have gone wrong in defining the role that
Yeah.
hinders your ability to
Yep.
accomplish more than you want?
Yep. Great. Sir.
I was going to ask, you mentioned public collaboration, and one of the problems you had was industry gives information to the government, but you're saying it's changing. In recent times, when we tried to give information to the government and needed threat intel back, it just doesn't come. It's still a one-way street. Do you see that changing and how?
So let me take the second one first. That is a wonderful question for Jen Easterly.
I'll make sure she's here next year. We'll organize.
So, in all seriousness, I know that making sure it's a two-way street has been a big piece of her one of her major goals. I mean, she ran a decent chunk of the security organization at Morgan Stanley before going into government. So she's been a victim of the one-way street that you're describing and has a personal commitment to making it more of a two-way street. I'm afraid that the details of it are kind of outside my remit, which I know is not a satisfying answer. So I think my daughter pointed this out about, so it's ambassador for cyberspace, not ambassador to. So one of her first questions was whether I would have an official avatar. And I wish, I mean, that would be cool. But I think to the serious point though about what did we get wrong in scoping the role, as currently constructed, I lead two organizations. I lead a bureau for cyberspace and digital policy, which is cyber and digital, no surprise, which is cable, fiber, satellites, data centers, wireless networks, kind of the architecture of the internet. And then I have a separate organization that is emerging tech, AI, quantum, and then a little bit of an outlier is biotech. There's so much convergence happening between, it's hard to talk cybersecurity in the next decade without also talking about AI and quantum. Hard to talk digital, hard to talk 6G without the integration of AI. So these things are, I think it probably ought to be one organization, not two. And maybe we'll have a chance with Congress to get another bite at that apple.
I would keep going. He's not looking.
Yeah,
Any others?
We'll take one more while he's distracted. Yeah.
In the back.
He's not distracted.
Yeah, right. But we got in one more.
Sorry, can you just can you
And then I need to go.
identify your name? Identify yourself.
Is it within your purview to address the regulatory environment across other jurisdictions, foreign jurisdictions, and can you talk about how your office is addressing where there are gaps in the coordination so that as the CISOs here are operating in multiple countries, they need to know what laws they need to abide by?
Yeah.
How do you
It's a very good question. So, and the answer is yes. I joke sometimes that I probably need to get an apartment in Brussels because we do have the responsibility of advocating for and negotiating on the regulatory side, bilaterally and multilaterally around the world. A big one, obviously, is with the EU. The Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, which have been passed, the forthcoming AI Act, the EU cybersecurity cloud scheme. I mean, there are so many pieces of this that affect not only American companies but global businesses that, if done wrong, are going to undermine good cybersecurity, are going to result in balkanized, fragmented legislative regulatory landscape. It becomes more expensive, less secure. Compliance goes from difficult to impossible. So the short answer is yes. We're involved on all of that. The EU is not a monolith. I think there are some member states who are very closely aligned with a general American point of view, and there's some that are not. A couple of overarching points I would make. The old kind of joke paradigm that the U.S. operates and Europe regulates, we've got to get past that. We need Europe building global businesses. It would be a huge miss if all the AI companies are American companies. Huge miss. Just like it's a huge miss that the hyperscale cloud providers are all American. That is a challenge for us diplomatically. Last thing, I'll leave it at that. I'm not advocating narrowly for American businesses necessarily. This is the State Department, not the Commerce Department. But we do want American businesses to succeed globally, to succeed on a level playing field, and to succeed in a way that's good for end users, which means regulatory harmonization. I've really enjoyed being here. I'm sorry I need to go.
Thank you. Run. Don't be late.